The hall was enormous. It was the kind of place that made you feel small on purpose. The Grand Conclave Station floated, the dark above a dying red star. Star gave off a dull orange light that came through the high windows and fell across the stone-like floor in long, tired strips. The walls were carved with the symbols of 47 species. Each symbol was old, each one meant something important to someone. Together they meant power. The seats in the main chamber curved in a wide circle, rising high like the inside of a bowl. Every seat was filled. Delegates from dozens of worlds sat in their corners, dressed in their colors, breathing their own filtered air through small masks or tubes or openings that were not mouths, but worked the same way. The noise of so many different bodies in one room was a low, steady hum, like a machine that never turned off. At the very center of the chamber floor, alone at a long table, sat Dr. Elena Vasquez. She was not tall, she was not young. Her hair had gone silver early, cut short and practical. She wore a plain dark jacket with the small blue pin of the Earth Diplomatic Service on the collar. No medals, no decorations. She had a glass of water in front of her and a thin tablet she had not looked at in over an hour. She had been sitting in this chamber for 6 hours. The reading of the resolution had taken most of that time. The Covenant's senior legal speaker, tall gray creature called a Velhari, had read every word of the document in a flat, careful voice. It was written in the formal language of the Covenant, a language that used many words to say simple things. Elena had understood all of it. She had studied Covenant law for 20 years. She knew exactly what it meant. Before the first sentence was finished, humanity was to be safeguarded. The word safeguarded had a specific legal meaning inside the Covenant. It meant a species was placed under oversight. Their ships would need permits to travel beyond their own systems. Their colonies could not expand without approval from a Covenant committee. Their trade agreements would be reviewed. Their research programs would be monitored. A Covenant oversight team would be stationed in the Sol system within 1 year. It was, in every practical sense, a polite cage built from paperwork and procedure, but a cage. The resolution had been in discussion for 3 years. Elena had known it was coming for 2. She had written 47 formal objections. She had requested 6 separate hearings. Every request had been delayed, redirected, or quietly buried. And so here she was. The Velhari finished reading. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Arkan Saraval rose from his high seat at the top of the curved wall. He was the presiding elder of the council, a Veth, ancient and slow-moving, with long pale fingers and dark eyes that had seen centuries pass. His voice was low and smooth, the kind of voice that had given bad news many times and had learned to make it sound reasonable. The resolution has been read in full, he said. It has been approved by 31 member species of the Covenant. It comes into effect in 40 days. He looked down at Elena. Does the representative of humanity acknowledge the resolution? The room waited. Elena reached forward and picked up her glass of water. She took a slow sip. She set it down carefully. She leaned toward the small speaker in front of her and said 2 words. From whom? The chamber made a sound, not a gasp exactly, but something close. A shifting, a murmur that moved through the seats like wind through grass. Arkin Saravel's pale fingers stilled on the edge of his podium. Pardon. The resolution states that humanity requires safeguarding, Elena said. Her voice was calm, clear, the kind of calm that was not the absence of emotion, but the careful management of it. I am asking a simple question. From whom does humanity require safeguarding? Name the threat. Saravel looked at her the way very old and important people look at things that are not behaving the way they should. The resolution covers a broad range of considerations regarding galactic stability. That is not an answer, Elena said. Another murmur, louder this time. Ambassador Vasquez, said a second council voice, the Kreth delegate, a large armored creature whose translator gave its words a buzzing edge. Resolution is a matter of covenant policy, it is not a personal accusation. I understand that, Elena said. She folded her hands on the table, but the word safeguarding has a meaning. In covenant law, in every law I have ever read, in any language spoken by any of the 47 species in this room, safeguarding means protection. You protect something from something else. So I'm asking what that something else is. I'm asking who threatens humanity. Give me a name, give me a species, give me a single recorded incident, give me anything. No one spoke. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it. The deliberations of the council are confidential, Saravel said at last. They are, Elena agreed, and yet the consequences of those deliberations are not. The consequences fall on 8 billion people on Earth and another 4 billion across the colonies, and every child born in the next century who will grow up under covenant oversight. Those people deserve to know what they are being protected from. The Velhari delegate leaned toward its own speaker. Ambassador, this chamber is not a court of appeal. I know what this chamber is, Elena said. I have sat in it for 6 hours. I know what every symbol on those walls means. I know the founding charter of this covenant by memory, including Article 17, which states that any safeguarding resolution must be grounded in documented and demonstrable threat assessment. She paused. I have not heard a threat assessed today. I heard a document read. Those are different things. Arkin Saravel looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes were unreadable. Then he looked at the other council members, and something passed between them, something Elena recognized. It was the look that powerful people exchanged when someone had said the true thing that they had hoped to avoid. The session will adjourn, Saravel said. We will reconvene. When? Elena asked. In due course. I would like a date. Ambassador. A date, she said again, not loudly, just firmly. Saravel's jaw tightened. 3 days. Elena nodded once. Thank you. The chamber began to empty. Delegates filed out in their groups, speaking quietly in their own languages. A few of them looked at Elena as they passed. Some looked away quickly. One, a small, soon counselor with copper-colored scales, met her eyes for a moment and gave the faintest dip of the head. It was not much, it was something. When the last delegate had gone, Elena was alone in the great chamber. She did not get up right away. She sat at the long table and looked up at the dome above her head, where a star map was. Hundreds of lights marking hundreds of worlds connected by thin silver lines. She found Saul easily. It was near the edge, a small light surrounded by Bigger, older, more connected lights. She looked at it for a while. Then she opened her tablet and began to write. The message was long, it was careful, it named everything she had observed and everything she had concluded. She sent it to her assistant. She sent it to a journalist she trusted on Mars, and she sent it to an old friend, a man currently commanding a fleet of ships somewhere in the dark between stars. She sealed the tablet, finished her water, and stood up. The chamber was quiet around her. The old symbols on the walls watched her go outside the wide doors in the long corridor that smelled of recycled air and old metal. She stopped and stood very still for a moment. A maintenance drone rolled past her feet, humming softly. She took one slow breath. Then she walked. Elena did not sleep that night. Her quarters on the station were small and clean, a bed, a desk, a narrow window that looked out into open space. She had lived in smaller places. She had slept in worse conditions, field tents, on colony worlds, emergency shelters, after disasters, once on the floor of a hospital on Europa while a fever burned through a mining settlement, and she was still young enough to think she could save everyone by staying awake. Old habits were hard to break. She sat at the desk with a cold cup of tea and worked. The Covenant's historical vaults were technically restricted to senior council members and certified research staff. Elena was neither, but 3 years ago, while preparing her first round of objections to the safeguarding proposal, she had been granted limited archive access by a counselor who owed her a professional courtesy she had never asked to be repaid. She had kept that access code quietly, the way a careful person keeps a key they hope they never need. She needed it now. She entered the code in the archive. Opened. The files were enormous. Thousands of documents, meeting records, testimony, transcripts, internal memos, threat assessments, economic reports, all from the 3 years the council had spent deliberating behind closed doors. She did not try to read everything. She searched. She had specific words in mind. She typed them one by one and followed where they led. The first thing she found was not a threat report. It was a trade document. It was a memo written 18 months ago by the Pharmaceutical Guild representatives of 4 Covenant species. It was addressed to the Council's Economic Subcommittee. It described, careful and polite language, the serious disruption being caused to established medicine markets. The disruption had a source. The source was human doctors and human researchers who had been sharing their medical technology freely, without patents, without licensing fees, without asking for anything in return. A human research team on Titan had developed a treatment for Veth bone decay. They had published it openly. Any species could use it. No one needed to pay for it. The Veth Pharmaceutical Guild, which had been selling a much older and less effective treatment for centuries, had lost most of its market in under a year. A graduate student at the University of New Nairobi, 24 years old, working on a small grant, almost out of funding, had accidentally found a compound that neutralized the toxin responsible for a wasting disease that affected Velhari children. She had messaged the findings directly to a Velhari Medical Institute. No payment requested, no agreement signed. Just a message that said she thought they should know. The Guild memo called this behavior economically destabilizing. Elena stared at that phrase for a long time. She kept searching. The next file that stopped her was a military analysis. It had been written by the Covenant's own Strategic Review Board, a group of senior officials from 6 species tasked with assessing threats to Covenant order. The document was marked highly sensitive. It had never been shared outside the Council's inner circle. It described a border conflict that had taken place 2 years ago near the outer Reach territories. A Kreth battle fleet of 200 warships had moved into a disputed zone. 1 human frigate had been in the area. A small patrol vessel called the Arden. Crew of 11, lightly armed, not designed for combat against a fleet of that size. By any calculation, it should have been over in minutes. It had lasted 9 days. The Arden had not won. It had not destroyed the fleet. What it had done was refused to be destroyed. The crew had used asteroid fields, debris clouds, communication interference, false signals, and at one point, according to the report, had parked the ship inside a hollow comet and gone completely dark for 31 hours while the Kreth searched for them. When the Kreth finally pulled back, they filed an official complaint. The complaint described the crew's behavior as tactically irrational. The report noted, with what Elena read as genuine bewilderment, that the crew appeared to view the situation not as a military engagement, but as a problem to be solved. The Strategic Review Board's conclusion was 2 sentences long. It said, human forces do not respond to superior numbers in the expected manner. Standard deterrence models do not apply. Elena leaned back in her chair. She thought about that for a while. She kept going, file after file, out after hour, the tea going cold beside her. Each document added something new. Human colony ships that had settled 3 new worlds in a decade, a pace no other species had matched in 500 years of recorded Covenant history. A human colony administrator on a border world who had walked alone into an active conflict zone between 2 warring species with no weapons and no authority, and talked both sides into a ceasefire that held. A human engineer on a Covenant joint project station who had redesigned a failing life support system in 6 hours, using spare parts and a process no Covenant engineer had ever considered, because it had never been tried before. None of these things were aggressive. None of them were cruel. None of them involved humanity trying to conquer or intimidate or control anything. But every single one of them had made something uncomfortable for the Covenant's old order. Every single one had quietly shown that the way things had always been done was not the only way. And every single one had ended up in the Council's deliberation files, marked as evidence in support of the safeguarding resolution. Elena understood now. The Council had not built a cage around humanity because they feared what humanity might become. They had built it because of what humanity already was. Active, generous, stubborn, willing to go into places it was not supposed to go, and help in ways it was not supposed to help, and refuse outcomes it was not supposed to refuse. It was not danger they feared, it was change. She compiled everything into a single file. She organized it carefully: the trade memos, the military analysis, the settlement records, the individual stories. She added her own notes. She made it readable, clear, simple enough that anyone could understand what it meant. Then she sent it, 3 copies, 3 destinations, her assistant who was very good at making information travel fast, the journalist on Mars who had been asking the right questions about the Covenant for years and had never quite had enough to go on, and Admiral Yusuf HFY, currently somewhere in deep space with the 3rd Colonial Fleet, a man she had known since they were both 22 years old and studying in the same cramped library on a research station above Jupiter. She sent the file and sat back and waited. The answer from HFY came faster than she expected. He had always been quick. It was one of the things she had always respected about him. He read fast, thought fast, and decided without wasting time on doubt once the facts were clear. His message was 3 words. Course already changed. Elena read it twice, then she closed her tablet, pushed back from the desk, and walked to the narrow window. Space outside was dark and full of stars. Somewhere out there, a fleet of human ships was moving. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. Good, she said quietly to no one. Then she went to make a fresh cup of tea because there was a lot more work to do before morning. The Covenant's charter was old. Most of the species in the station had forgotten large parts of it. That was the thing about very old laws. People stopped reading them carefully once they felt safe enough not to. Elena had read all of it many times in 3 different translations. She filed the formal request at the start of the 2nd day. Article 40, one of the Covenant's founding charter, stated clearly that any species placed under a safeguarding resolution had the right to public hearing before the resolution came into effect. Hearing had to be open, no closed sessions, no confidential proceedings. Every delegate in the Covenant had to be given the chance to observe. The Council's legal team tried to delay it. They said the article applied only to species who had held Covenant membership for more than 50 years. Elena had already found the counterargument, a precedent from 200 years ago when the article had been applied to species that had held membership for only 12 years. She had found it the same night she went through the archive. She sent the precedent to 3 Covenant judges before the legal team had finished writing its objection. 2 of the 3 judges replied within the hour. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Elena spent the rest of that day making calls. The first call was to a man named Counselor DeHav. He was soon a species with copper scales and careful eyes. He had always been quiet in council sessions. He never spoke loudly or dramatically, but he listened closely, and he voted thoughtfully, and he had never once voted out of fear. That made him different from most of the others. Elena asked him for one thing, not his vote, not his public support, just his help in reaching 3 people who had asked to never be part of Covenant political proceedings again. DeHav was silent for a moment, then he said he understood, then he made the calls himself. The second thing Elena did was write her opening statement for the hearing. She did not write it as an argument. She did not write it as an attack. She wrote it as a series of questions, because questions were harder to dismiss than statements, and because the right question asked in the right room could do more than 100 speeches. The hearing opened the next morning. The chamber was fuller than it had been. For the resolution reading, word had spread fast through the station. Delegates who had not been present before filled the upper gallery seats. Media drones hummed near the ceiling, transmitting to every connected world. Elena had counted on that. She needed people watching, not just Covenant. Delegates, everyone. Arkin Saravel opened the session with visible reluctance. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, which was strange, because he was already 300 years old, and 2 days should not have mattered, but something in his posture had changed. He sat straighter than before, as though bracing for something. Elena thanked the council for the hearing, then she called her first witness. The elder walked slowly to the speaking platform. She was Velhari, tall with pale, feathered ridges along her neck and hands that trembled slightly with age. Her name was Counselor Maris, and she was 411 years old, which was not especially old for Velhari. She had been a senior representative in her home world's government for most of that life. She spoke quietly. She described a disease. It had appeared on her world 30 years ago, a fast-moving engineered plague that attacked the nervous system. The Covenant's medical authority had quarantined the planet within 48 hours. That was the correct procedure. Quarantine contained spread. Quarantine also meant nothing went in, including medicine, including help. The review process to approve outside medical assistance had a standard timeline of 8 months. Within 11 weeks, 400,000 Velhari children were dead. A young human woman named Dr. Priya Maida had been working on a research grant studying Velhari cellular biology. From a station 2 systems away, she had been working alone. She had run out of funding 3 weeks before and had been using her own savings to stay on the station. When she heard about the quarantine, she applied through official channels to send her findings to the Velhari Medical Institute. The application was rejected. Quarantine protocol. She sent the findings anyway, directly to the lead researcher at the institute. In a personal message, she wrote very simply that she thought the compound she had found might help and that she was sorry she could not do more from where she was. The institute tested the compound. It worked. Within 6 months, a treatment was available. Priya Maida was later fined by the Covenant regulatory body for violating quarantine communication protocol. The fine was the equivalent of 18 months of her salary. She had paid it without complaint. Maris finished speaking. The chamber was very quiet. She returned to her seat and Elena called her second witness. He was Graf, a species that resembled something between a bear and a piece of heavy machinery. He stood at the platform like a boulder that had learned to breathe. His name was Chieftain Borek, and he had the kind of voice that did not need a speaker system. He described a war, a border conflict between his people and a neighboring species that had been burning for 60 years before the Covenant formally classified it as an unresolved territorial dispute and assigned it to a mediation committee. The committee had met 43 times in 20 years and produced no agreement. A human colony administrator named Marcus Webb had been working on a trade post at the edge of the conflict zone. He had no authority over either party. He had no military backing. He had arrived at the border post 6 months into a particularly bad escalation cycle, carrying a translation tablet, and Borek paused here and something in his expression shifted. Sandwiches. Elena had not expected the pause. She watched the chamber. A few delegates Exchanged glances, one was smiling. Webb had sat down with representatives. Of both sides, he had brought food, he had asked questions, he had listened, he had come back the next day and done the same thing. He had done it for 11 days. He had no authority to promise anything. So he had promised nothing. He had simply sat and listened and asked. And talked until on the 12th day both sides had agreed to a 3-month ceasefire to explore terms. The ceasefire had held for 2 years. Formal peace process was now underway. Borak looked at the council when he finished and said simply, he did not need permission to care. The third witness was small, young. She wore the dark jacket of a covenant diplomatic attaché. Her name was Lyra. And she was 26 years old. She had been 4 when the siege of Kelmara happened. She didn't remember much of it. She remembered the noise. She remembered the dark. She remembered being very cold and very afraid, and then being lifted by arms that were large and warm and smelled like sweat and burnt metal. She had been carried 7 km through a city that was falling apart. The man who carried her had been shot twice. He had not put her down. His name was Sergeant Daniel Cross. He had survived. He was currently teaching physical education at a school in New Auckland. Lyra did not look at the council when she spoke. She looked at the media drones near the ceiling, because she understood the way young people sometimes understand things better than old ones, that the people in this room were not the only audience that mattered outside the station on a border world, that the Covenant's aid vessels had declined to enter due to an ongoing procedural review. Admiral Akafer's fleet was unloading supplies, medical equipment, water filtration units, emergency shelter material. The fleet had arrived 17 hours ago. They had not asked permission to enter the system. They had sent a single message ahead of their arrival that simply stated, "There are people here who need help and we are coming." The feeds from that world were being broadcast on the same channels as the hearing. Elena watched the faces of the council. As they watched the feeds, she saw Arkin Saravel's expression change very slowly. The way ice changes when a warm season finally arrives. It did not break, it just became less certain of itself. That was enough for now. She called no more witnesses. She thanked the chamber and sat down. The session was adjourned for deliberation, but the deliberation was no longer only happening inside the chamber. It was happening everywhere. The chamber filled faster than anyone expected. It was the 3rd day, the final session, the one where the council would either defend the resolution or let it fall. The upper galleries had never been at full capacity in living memory. Most Covenant proceedings were dry and slow, and attended by people who had no choice. Today every seat was taken. Extra standing space had been opened. Behind the rear columns, media drones formed a buzzing line near the ceiling, their small lights blinking in the recycled air. Elena arrived early as she always did. She sat at the center table, arranged her notes, and drank a cup of water. Her assistant, a young man named Tomas, who had been with her for 4 years and had learned to read her silences better than most people read faces, set a second cup of water beside the first, without being asked, and then stepped back and said nothing. Arkin Saravel opened the session without ceremony. He looked like a man who had not slept, for being 300 years old. That said something. Spoke for a long time. Elena listened. Carefully, she had expected anger or dismissal. What she got was something more honest than either. He told the truth as the council understood it, which meant it was partially the truth wrapped in reasonable-sounding language. He said the council's concern was not malice. He said that no one in the covenant wished humanity harm. He said the resolution had been born from a genuine concern about balance, about stability. Humanity moved fast, it changed things. The galaxy had a rhythm built over thousands of years, and that rhythm was fragile, and fragile things needed protecting. He said the word protecting and seemed not to notice the weight of it. Elena waited until he finished, then she stood. She did not use her notes. She began not with humanity but with the covenant. She talked about its history, not the founding stories, not the noble charter language, but the actual record of what had happened in the centuries since its creation. She talked about the War of the Veth, succession which had burned for 80 years before the covenant formally intervened, and only then, because two of the warring species were significant trading partners whose destruction would have been economically inconvenient. She talked about the Great Famine, food crisis on a small species homeworld that had been classified as an internal resource management issue by the Covenant's Economic Committee while 12 million people died. She talked about the Covenant mediation committees that had met and met and met, again generating documents and procedures and review cycles while wars continued and plagues spread and whole cultures quietly disappeared. She did not raise her voice. That was important. Raised voices could be dismissed as emotion. She wanted to be undismissible. She said the covenant was built to protect. That is in the charter. That is the founding purpose. And I have spent the last 2 days reading records from 300 years of covenant decisions, and I want to ask the chamber honestly, clearly, with everyone watching, how many times in those 300 years did the covenant move fast enough to actually save someone? Silence. I found records of 3 instances, she said, 3 in 300 years where the covenant acted quickly enough to prevent a catastrophe rather than simply recording one. 3 times, humanity has been traveling between stars for 40 years. In those 40 years, I found 61 recorded instances of human individuals or crew or colony teams acting without authorization, without committee approval, without procedural clearance, and saving lives. She let that settle. 61 times in 40 years, she said, against 3 times in 300 years. And we are the ones being told we need to be managed. The Kreth delegate shifted in its seat. The sound of its armored body moving was loud in the quiet room. Ambassador, it said, you are comparing very different scales of action. I am comparing outcomes, Elena said. I do not care about scales. I care about whether people lived or died. That is a simple measurement. Anyone can do it. She turned slightly, addressing the full circle of the chamber, the delegates in the high seats and the observers in the galleries and the blinking lights of the drones that were carrying her words to every connected world right now, in real time. The Archon spoke about balance, she said, about rhythm, about the galaxy having an order that must be maintained. I understand that. Order matters. Systems matter. I have spent my entire adult life working within systems because I believe that rules and Structures, when they are made well, protect people who need protecting. She paused. But I have also spent my entire adult life watching what happens when systems become more important than the people they were built for, when the process is preserved and the person is lost, when the committee meets and the famine continues, when the review is pending, and the plague spreads, when the rhythm is maintained and the dying is steady and quiet enough not to disturb anyone. She looked directly at Archon Saravel. You called us dangerous, you said we move too fast, you said we don't ask permission, that we don't respect established order, that we disrupt the balance. She held his gaze. I have read every document your council produced in 3 years of deliberation. I know what frightened you. It was not a war. It was a graduate student who sent her research to a dying planet without waiting for approval. It was a colony administrator who sat down with enemies and brought sandwiches. It was 11 people in a small ship who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. She let the silence hold for a moment. You are not afraid of what we might do, she said. You are afraid of what we make visible, because when we walk into a broken situation and start fixing it, without waiting, without asking, without calculating the political cost, we make it impossible to pretend the situation wasn't broken. And you have been pretending for a very long time. Her last words were quiet, almost gentle. I am still waiting for someone in this room to tell me who has been protecting the galaxy from you. No one spoke. It lasted a long time, that silence. Long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Then one of the smaller delegations, soon stood. Their senior representative, a young counselor who sat near the back and had never spoken in a full session before, activated her speaking light and said that she was withdrawing her species support for the resolution. Then the Velhari senior delegate stood and did the same. Then 3 more, then another 2. Then a cluster of 5 smaller species, whose representative rose together and spoke as a group, as though they had agreed on this before the session started, which Elena suspected they had. Archon Saravel watched each withdraw. His face was still. He was 300 years old, and he had managed crises before, but his hands, Elena noticed, were very still on the podium, the kind of still that was not calm but control. The quorum count was being tracked on the chamber's main display. It dropped below the required threshold at the 14th withdrawal. The resolution had no legal force. Without quorum, Saravel formally acknowledged the count. He declared the resolution suspended, pending further review. His voice was the same smooth, low voice it had always been. He was very good at his job. He did not let anything show. Elena sat down. Thomas slid a coffee across the table. Without a word, she had not asked for coffee. She had not told him she preferred it to tea when things were difficult, because she had never needed to. He had simply learned. She wrapped both hands around the cup and watched the chamber. Delegates were already moving, talking, transmitting. The noise level rose like a tide coming in. The drones near the ceiling banked and adjusted, following the movement of the room, broadcasting all of it. Somewhere across the station, in a private chamber she would never see, Archon Saravel was probably already thinking about the next move. She did not underestimate him. He was smart and old and not finished, But today in this room the question had been asked clearly enough that the galaxy had heard it. That was what mattered. She drank her coffee and waited for whatever came next. The weeks after the hearing were not quiet. There was no single dramatic moment, no great celebration, no speech on the steps of something important. What happened instead was slower and stranger, and in Elena's experience far more real, a long, complicated process of people deciding what to do with a thing that had changed. The resolution was suspended. That meant it was not dead, only paused. A legal suspension could last months before requiring a new vote, and a new vote could go either way. Elena knew that. She did not mistake a pause for a victory. But other things were moving now. The journalist on Mars had published the archived documents, the trade memos, the strategic reports. The story of the Ardent, the 61 instances, had spread across every connected network in the Covenant's reach, not all at once, in pieces over days, as different readers found different parts and shared them. Forward, the story of Priya Mehta and her research, the fine she paid, the children who lived had been translated into 22 languages within 4 days. Elena had not arranged that. It had simply happened the way things happened. When the right information reached the right people, messages came in from places she did not expect. A scientist on a Vilhari research station asking if there was a way to set up a formal exchange program with human universities that did not require the Covenant's approval process. A Grath Community Council on a border world asking if the human colony on the next planet over would be interested in a joint infrastructure project. A Soon Medical Institute asking whether Dr. Priya Mehta would be willing to come and speak at a conference on applied biology. Elena forwarded all of them to the right people and said nothing about what she had done to make any of it possible. Toma organized her schedule and refilled her water glass and did not make any comments, which was how she knew he was proud of her. The harder conversation was with the council. Saravel requested a private meeting 4 days after the suspension. Elena went alone. They sat in a small room off the main corridor, not a formal chamber, just a room with 2 chairs and a low table and the kind of lighting that was meant to feel neutral. Saravel had brought nothing, no documents, no aids. He sat with his long, pale hands resting on his knees and looked at her with his old, dark eyes and said that he had spent 40 years building consensus and she had dismantled a 3-year decision in 3 days. Elena said she had not dismantled anything. She had asked a question. He said the question had been a weapon. She said a question was only a weapon if the answer was something you were hiding. He was quiet for a long moment after that. Then he said, surprising her slightly, that she was probably right. He asked what she wanted, not what humanity wanted, what she wanted. She told him, a restructured accord, not humanity joining the Covenant on the Covenant's current terms, because those terms were built for a different era and a different pace, something new. Partnership structure where species shared decisions instead of managing each other, a faster process for humanitarian action, one that didn't require 8 months of review before a doctor could help a dying child. Transparent records, open deliberation, or at least more of it than there had been. Saravel listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "It would take time." He said some of the council would resist. He said the trade guilds would be furious. Elena said she understood all of that. He asked if she was willing to stay on the station to work through it properly. She said yes. She asked if he was willing to work through it honestly. He looked at her for a moment, then he said in his smooth and careful voice that he would try. She did not need him to promise more than that, trying from a man 300 years old who had built his career on caution was not nothing. She thanked him. They shook hands in the human way, which he had learned long ago and used deliberately now. When she came back to her quarters, there was a message from Admiral HFY. He had been invited officially to address the council in a formal session, the first time in Covenant history that a human military officer had received such an invitation. He had declined the podium. Instead, he had walked into the council's meeting room on the third day of discussion, sat down at the table as though he belonged there, which he did, and started talking to people, not speaking at them, talking to them. He had stayed for 3 days. He had drunk 17 cups of tea from 17 different species. He had learned the Velhari word for compromise, which was a very long word, but which he had memorized and used correctly, which had made the Velhari delegation laugh in a way that their species almost never did in formal settings. Elena read the message and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for a long time. On Earth, the news had been received without fanfare. She had expected some celebration speeches, crowds outside government buildings, the kind of public response that politicians used to show. They understood the moment. There was some of that, not much. Mostly what happened was ordinary. People went to work, colony ships filed their departure clearances and lifted off. Scientists published findings. Engineers argued about load-bearing calculations. Children went to school. Her mother sent her a message that said, "Good work, come home soon, I made soup." Elena read that message 3 times. On the last evening before she began the formal accord negotiations, she stood at the observation window in her quarters and looked at the stars. The window was narrow and the glass was cold, and the stars were the same stars. They had always been indifferent to all of it, patient in the way that only very old things could afford to be. Counselor D have found her there. He knocked at the open door and she waved him in. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the same stars and did not say anything for a long time, which she appreciated. He had always known when talking was the right thing and when it wasn't. Eventually he said, "What do humans fear most? I have always wondered. It is clearly not numbers or isolation or death from what I can observe." Elena thought about it genuinely, not the diplomatic answer, not the answer she might have given in a chamber, the real one. "Stillness," she said. "We're afraid of stopping." D have turned that over. His copper scales caught the starlight through the glass. "Yes," he said after a long time, "that is the thing that frightened us most." They stood at the window together and looked at the stars. Between them was the quiet that exists between two people who have been on opposite sides of something difficult and have both come through it without losing the ability to stand in the same room. It was not a comfortable quiet. It was not supposed to be. It was the kind of quiet that was honest. Outside in the dark, a human colony ship was moving somewhere between 2 points On that glittering star map, carrying people and tools and seeds and the particular kind of forward momentum that did not require permission or applause, or even a destination, yet fully chosen. Moving because stopping was the one thing that had never felt possible. Elena watched the stars. The negotiations would begin tomorrow. They would be hard and slow and frustrating and necessary. Some people would be reasonable, some would not. Things would break and need to be rebuilt differently. That was how it went with things worth doing. She was not afraid of any of it. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and felt the faint hum of the station through her palm. The great mechanical heartbeat of a place that held 47 worlds in uneasy conversation. All of them still trying to learn what living together actually meant. It was a start. It had always only ever been a start. That was enough.